Okay, so in this integral, you have a composition of functions because you have a cosine of x squared, so you have to use u substitution. And what we're going to try to do is choose our inner function as our u and see if it's going to give us the right setup. So we're going to say that let u be equal to x squared. Then we're going to take the derivative with respect to x, and it's going to be equal to 2x, which means that du is equal to 2x dx. Now it looks promising because we could easily put a 2 here and then multiply the outside by 1/2. So we have our dx, 2x dx inside. The only thing we have to do is change our limits of integration. So we need to convert from x to u. So our one limit of integration is going to be square root of pi, and our lower limit of integration is 0. Now, by our definition of what we're choosing the u to be, u is x squared. So if I square the x, which is square root of pi, I get pi. And if I square the 0, I get 0. So these are going to be my new limits of integration. So before we rewrite everything in terms of u, I'm just going to rearrange my integral so it's easier to see where everything is coming from. So we have cosine of x squared, 2x dx, and then I'm ready to rewrite everything. So this will become cosine of u, this will become du, this will become 0, and this will become pi. So my new integral is going to be 1/2 integral from 0 to pi of cosine of u du. And then we're just going to use the fundamental theorem of calculus. So our antiderivative of cosine of u is sine of u. And we're going to integrate it from 0 to pi. So we end up having 1/2 sine of pi minus 1/2 sine of 0. Sine of pi is 0, sine of 0 is 0, so we just get 0 as our answer. Now, what you can also do is just make sure that this makes sense. So if you imagine a graph of cosine from 0 to pi, it looks like this, right? Now this makes sense because the total area from 0 to pi, so the area above the x-axis and the area below the x-axis are going to be equal and have opposite signs. So when we integrate and we're looking for the total area from 0 to pi, our answer will be 0 because our positive area and our negative area cancel each other out. Now in this question, it's not very obvious, but you don't actually even use your substitution. You are going to use the fact that the function you have here is odd function. And when you have an odd function and you want to integrate from negative pi over 2 in this case, over to pi over 2, so you go equally to the right and equally to the left. I'm just going to use any odd function. So if you're going to go from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2, your total area is going to be 0 because your area above the x-axis and the area below the x-axis will cancel each other out. So how would you know that this is an odd function? Well, if you kind of break it up and you take a look at this function separately, so if you think of it as a product of x squared over 1 plus x to the 6 times sine of x, you recognize that this is an even function because the two exponents you have are even, so if you try to replace x with negative x, you get exactly the same answer. And sine of x is an odd function. And when you multiply an even function by an odd function, you get odd function. And because your limits of integration are exactly the same and one is a positive, one is negative, the resulting area will just be 0. And that's really it. You would have to write something You have to find something, write something indicating that you realize that this happens because it's an odd function, but you don't have to actually do any work. You can't actually integrate it. You can only realize that it's an odd function, and because you're going from negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2, it's actually going to be 0. And be careful if, for some reason, let's say if I change this to negative pi over 3 to pi over 2, where the limits of integration are not the same, you cannot make any assumptions at all. So you can't find it. So impossible to find without a calculator or to integrate. So make sure that they're using the fact that it's an odd function only when it is reasonable. So it has to actually have the same limits of integration, and one has to be positive and one has to be negative. And then number 48 has this, it's exactly the same thing. So basically, you have an odd function that is raised to a odd degree, so the whole thing is another odd function. And you're integrating from negative pi over 3 to positive pi over 3, so both numbers are the same, and one is positive, one is negative. So that's it. You could say since sine of 5 theta, or sine of theta to the 5th power is odd, and the limits of integration are the same, so that's it.